Alrighty, so chapter 16 is called America's Gilded Age, but we've already talked about the transformation of the West, and so now we're going to get actually into the Gilded Age. Again, review the learning objectives, make sure you're familiar with those. So to talk about the Industrial Revolution, let's take a step back and look at what pre-industrial America was like. America was very rural. It was, you didn't have a lot of urban centers. You had centers of commerce like New York, Boston, Baltimore, even Washington, D.C. But it was very disjointed and not very, travel between one place and another was not very easy to do. If you were a merchant or you were trying to, let's say you sell textile, typically what you would use is the putting out system or the cottage system. And essentially you would take the raw material, let's say the cotton, and if you're following along at the bottom of the screen, the merchant would take it to the cottages. Typically women would be doing this where they would spin the cotton into yarn, and then you would take it to the weavers' cottages where the weavers would take the yarn and then, using a loom that was in the house, they would produce the cloth, and then you had the finished cloth, and then you would take that along. Workers were not traveling, workers were in their home. You were also subject to anything else going on in the home. So if you were using women to spin the yarn or make the cloth, typically they had household duties that they had to attend to, or children first, before they could actually get to producing your finished product. So the home was the location of production. The infrastructure needs were minimal. Most people were using rivers or streams to get from one place to the next. Travel on roads was very precarious and not very efficient. Your labor needs, again, were mostly women or children. Most people were working on the farm. Men would have been working on the farm. And it was a very insular area or community, meaning that it focused inward. It was not, you didn't have a lot of travelers coming in and out of towns. You basically knew everybody that was in your community, and you relied upon each other for protection, but also for commerce and for goods and selling. Like if you had something to sell, typically you would sell it to a neighbor rather than trying to ship it to a market. Other concept to think about is biological versus industrial time. Industrial time doesn't come about obviously until the Industrial Revolution. So biological time meant, when the sun came up, you were out in the fields. When the sun went down, you would come in from the fields and do whatever chores you needed to do before bedtime. So the sun was really the alarm clock per se. You didn't really need clocks because you could tell time basically by the sun. So if we look at a model, this is a museum in Massachusetts called Old Sturbridge Village, and it kind of gives you a snapshot of what pre-industrial America looked like. You had a church at the very center, which you can see. I'm going to try and mark it right here. It had a clock in the tower, and that was really the clock for the town in order to keep time. You mostly had a common area, which would have been used for festivals or events, also for common grazing, but you might have a blacksmith, you might have a storekeeper, and the storekeeper would be bringing goods in from outside of the town and may have to go to, like in this case, this is in Massachusetts, so they would go to Boston to get goods, and then maybe once a month or something like that. So when England goes through its Industrial Revolution, it doesn't take very long for the United States to follow suit. We've always been very strong trading partners. So what happens in England usually comes to the United States, a few years later. So the Industrial Revolution in England started in the textile industry, and of course that follows suit in the American Industrial Revolution. So you had a factor owned a factory. Clever, huh? But the factor you had to have investors, typically. But they were the manager, the owner of the factory and the machinery. So what was different about a factory from the pre-industrial period is that the location of production moved to the factory. So now, if you wanted to work or earn money making cloth, you no longer did it in your home in your free time. You now came to the factory. So that required the ability to travel. It also meant that the center of production, being the factory, the finished product would have to be shipped to market by roads or however, river, what have you. So that was a little bit of a change. Also, when you take someone out of the home and you bring them in, let's say from 9 to 5, you're no longer distracted by things going on at home. So you are much more focused. And so therefore your production goes up. And you usually have a supervisor, somebody that you would report to. In the textile industry, the machinery had little small gears and parts to it. And so early on in the Industrial Revolution, both in Britain and the United States, children and women were preferred because they had smaller hands. Also, they were also cheap labor. You could pay women and children a lot less than you would a man. And if you were a supervisor in a factory, typically you were a man. Women did not rise into supervisor positions very often. So I bring in this gentleman in the middle, Frederick Winslow Taylor. He creates this idea of scientific management. And this is a Gilded Age thing that really falls in line with like Fordism, as we'll talk about later. But Frederick Winslow Taylor believed that he could remake the workplace through the use of a stopwatch. That he would sit and watch, let's say, someone shoveling coal, and he would time how long, maybe it took the worker to shovel, to get the coal onto the shovel, and then how long it took him to throw that coal into the furnace. And then he began thinking about, through kind of a scientific method, of how to make things more efficient and less time-consuming. And so if you've ever been involved in a time study, they do these sometimes where they'll break down a task that you have to do at work into steps, and they time each step, and that determines how many people are going to be working at a certain time. So if you're working in a restaurant and you have, they're timing you to see how long it takes you to place an order, get the order from the kitchen, take the order to the table, and let's say they know they have 300 customers coming in, they have to figure out how many servers they need in order to bring all that food from the kitchen. And this was all kind of a scientific way of managing staff. So Lowell, Massachusetts is a good example of industrial America. This is a national park site now, and you can go visit. But it shows you the textile mills. It, of course, ran off of water. Water power ran most of the mills in Lowell. But one of the interesting things about it is this timetable over here shows you how things were broken down. And so during industrial time, you start having quarter, half, and 3/4 of an hour. And it would break down the day into different segments. So instead of having biological time where you have the sun up and sun down, now you have the concept of time is money. Time becomes a commodity. And so therefore, we're going to break it down. The mill workers were usually young girls that were from the area, and they would come and live in dormitories there in Lowell, and then they would report to the factory, and they had these bells that would basically, like a school bell, tell you where you needed to be and at what time. So you may go and have breakfast, the bell would ring, that would tell you to come in to the factory. Then you would have a lunch bell to tell you you have a lunch break, that sort of thing. So, in terms of industrialization, there are six things that you need for industrialization, or what you may call ingredients of industrialization. Surplus food, which we've talked about because of the mechanized agriculture in the West. Laborers, workers. This is coming largely through immigration, capital, markets, and markets are kind of a segment of transportation as well, because you have to get your goods to market. Inventions or new technology, and of course, transportation and infrastructure. So we talked about this agricultural revolution going on in the West in the previous module. The number of farms, people living on farms, the value of farms is all going up. And you're producing an agricultural surplus, which also means you're not needing as many people to work on a farm as you would need otherwise. So you start seeing the slow process of movement from the farm to the city. This is something that will take a while to happen, but it begins to happen during this period, largely because the agricultural revolution is fueling the industrial revolution taking place in places like New York, Boston, and other cities. And you can see in these charts, urban and rural populations, slowly but surely, by 1920, we start to see a larger urban population than we see a rural population. And that is a process that really takes from the 1860s down to the 1920s to happen. Immigration, we've talked about. There are two major waves. The first wave occurs 1861 to 1890, and these are Northern European and Western European immigrants, mostly Irish, English, and German. And what's interesting about them is that they assimilate very easily. Obviously, the American colonies were founded by the British, so it's easy for us to, consider, all of us of the same type and all of that stuff. Blonde hair, blue eyes, all that kind of good stuff. But the second major wave, taking place in 1891 to 1920, is Eastern European and Southern Europe. And these were a little bit more darker skinned. They had different religions. They had different cultures. They were a little bit more set apart from the typical American person, so to speak. So we start seeing a shift in terms of acceptance of the second wave immigrants as opposed to the first wave. So you have 25 million immigrants who arrived between 1865 and 1915, and that was 4 times the number that came previously in the previous 50 years. So huge amounts of immigrants coming into the United States. And as I said, in that first wave, you have German, Irish, and English immigrants who don't necessarily stay in the city. They will move into rural areas, and that's one of the big impacts in terms of the agricultural revolution, is that these were farmers in their homeland, and so now they're coming to the United States. There's the opportunity through the Homestead Act to pick up free land, so why not move out west and create a farm? And the primary source from Module 3, is that right? Yeah, Module 3, shows you it's a German family or a Germanic family. So it kind of reinforces that whole idea. So what we begin to see is immigration regulation or processing centers that begin to develop. And this all goes along with the idea of social Darwinism, which is the old idea of survival of the fittest. And naturally, the white Anglo-Saxon male is at the tippy top of that pyramid. And anybody that doesn't look like the white Anglo-Saxon male kind of falls further down below them on that pyramid. And Charles Darwin, it all stems from his theory of evolution, that there are variations over time. Darwin never wanted this applied to human society, but Herbert Spencer, in his creation of social Darwinism and survival of the fittest, is really the culprit for this. And then Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, comes up with this idea of eugenics, that you can actually breed humans to bring out more substantial and more positive traits, which is kind of an odd way of thinking. But, of course, social Darwinism and eugenics are the forerunners to the beliefs that Adolf Hitler will ascribe to in the 1930s. So they linger. We're talking about this in the 1800s, but they'll stick around. So New York City becomes the first home for the Immigrant Processing Center. In the upper right-hand corner, Castle Garden was an old fort from the War of 1812 that was converted into a number of different things, but it eventually becomes an immigrant processing center. When the immigration overruns, or there are too many immigrants to handle at this place, they create Ellis Island, and that's the bottom right. San Francisco's version of Ellis Island is called Angel Island. And so basically what the processing does is it looks for diseased people who might be carrying disease, people who were quote unquote undesirable, who might have, might have some sort of mental issue or mental capability issue. You name it. There are a number of different things that they're looking at, but they only want the best of the best to come into the United States. Essentially, is what it is. If you're very, very poor and you don't seem to have any education and you don't have a skill, then chances are you're going to get turned away. If you have a profession, if you're a doctor, lawyer, whatever, then it was like a free ride. You could go right on through. But if you didn't have a skill and you didn't have a profession, then you were pretty much SOL. So the American society at this point is, in terms of capitalism, is looking at a laissez-faire economy. This is free enterprise. Adam Smith in 1776 wrote The Wealth of Nations, which was his premier work, where basically he outlines the whole system of capitalism. But it's basically allowing the market to decide its own pricing, to decide its own fate, rather than have the government coming in and dictating this. And it's all a really great idea. However, you've got to think about the Gilded Age is a great example of why laissez-faire doesn't necessarily work, because you have a great deal of greed and corruption that takes place during this time period. First off, you have the trust, which is a new document coming, or a new arrangement that comes out of the head of Henry Flagler and J.D. Rockefeller, who formed the Standard Oil Trust. And the picture to the right is a cartoon making fun of Standard Oil. Basically, the Standard Oil Trust would come in and, let's say they come into, they buy an oil field. They would undercut the competition until the competition went out of business. And then they would buy up the competition and then raise the prices, so that basically they're establishing a monopoly. There are two types of government or structure in terms of company. There's the vertical integration and the horizontal integration. Vertical integration is basically buying up all of the steps to produce the final good, or let's say from basically the creation of the raw materials all the way through to the finished product and to the marketplace. Carnegie is a great example of this. U.S. Steel buys up the mines that would mine the iron ore. They would buy up the refineries for the steel refineries for the steel, and then they would, you know, buy up the railroad, which would transport the steel. So all of the pieces of the company, whatever it touched, were owned by U.S. Steel, and he made millions and billions of dollars off of this. What's funny is there is a panic, a depression that takes place, and the government needs, I'm sure we'll be talking about this, but the government needed an influx of capital. So they approached J.P. Morgan, and J.P. Morgan basically wrote a check and covered the government's funds, or the debt, the deficit of the government. That's how much money we're talking about. Horizontal integration is more along the lines of Standard Oil, where you have independent refineries which are all owned by the Standard Oil Trust, and they're all within their, competing companies all within the same industry. So a political cartoon talking about the tariff monopoly. Usually the capitalists were depicted on the right as overweight men, finely dressed, excuse me, and the workers and the rest of us were on the left-hand side, just giving them money and all of that, like putting riches before the kings. And they were the kings of commerce and capitalism. So in terms of inventions, the Gilded Age is probably second to none in terms of the inventions and innovations that are coming out of industry. I think it's 1893 Columbian Exposition. I don't think it's 1889. Anyway, the Columbian Exposition in Chicago, if you ever read the book Devil in the White City, or eventually I think they're making a movie, the White City refers to the Columbian Exposition because they built all these buildings to showcase technology, to celebrate the landing of Columbus in the New World. And this was a way to show off what American industry had been doing. So there was a lot about electricity, a lot about manufacturing, and a lot about transportation and railroads. And so these are images from the White City. Of course, the picture on the left shows you a lot about the electricity. The picture on the right at the bottom is the first Ferris wheel, and it was at the Columbian Exposition. Of course, it's no longer there. But the innovations that are really front and center in terms of American industry were on display here. And we're not just talking about, machinery. We're also talking about art, architecture, literature. There was a women's building. In the previous slide, there was a picture of the women's building talking about the role of women and what women have been able to accomplish in the United States. And as we mentioned, the railroads and the development of the railroads, we talked about that already. Largely what's pushing the development of railroads are land grants through the government, subsidies through government, and then access to raw materials and markets. And so the railroads were by no means poor. They had a great deal of money. But the government, of course, realized that if you expand or if you're subsidizing the railroads, it will increase commerce, it will increase trade. And so America is fascinated by trade. When most countries are thinking about raw materials, like Britain takes India as its colony, it's focused on the raw materials. The United States, when it has a colony, is focused on trade and developing trade networks. And so when the United States, picks up Puerto Rico or Guam or Hawaii, they're focused on expanding trade markets because, after all, we are a capitalist society. Chicago, as I mentioned, the home of the Columbian Exposition, is the center of a number of different things, including the stockyards. And as I mentioned in the last module about the cattle drives, um, Chicago becomes kind of the center for meat processing. And so the Union Stockyard and Transit Company, or Union Stockyards, are created and built on the outskirts of Chicago. And Swift and Armour are the two major companies that are backing the stockyards. And so, what's amazing about all of this is it was 375 acres of land. And at any one time within this facility, you could have 75,000 hogs, 21,000 cattle, and 22,000 sheep at any given time. By 1870, the yards could process 2 million animals in a year. And by 1890, they were processing 9 million animals a year. That's amazing. And you think about the needs in terms of natural resources, it's right along the Chicago River. And they would pump about 500,000 gallons of water into the stockyards each day. And I probably will not shock you by telling you that the Chicago River became a waste dump. You did not drink anything or come into contact with anything in that river. With the invention of the refrigerated car, you boost Chicago's importance, especially in terms of the stockyard, because now you can process the meat, cut it, and get it to New York within 2 days or a day by rail, and so it drives even more business coming through Chicago. The saying around the stockyard was, and you'll see it in that center postcard, "Round goes the wheel to the music of the squeal." They used every single part of the animal. Dial soap, for example, was the boiled off fat from the pigs when they were run through the processing, which is really, really gross to think about. But, the hooves and everything else could be used. Supposedly, they would say we use everything but the squeal, which is really kind of gross. Upton Sinclair writes a book about an expose about working in the Union stockyards. He intended it to be a story about the horrors of the working condition of the men. Instead, people read it into the way that the meat was being processed. And so Teddy Roosevelt passes the Food and Drug Act in I think it's 1901, that changes the way that the processing procedures are put into place. And so inadvertently creates food safety. Here's an image of the stockyards. It's not hard to believe that they can do all of that and store all of those animals in place. So talking about Gilded Age politics, you can't talk about the Gilded Age without talking about the political machine. And this is, a great example is Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. And the way that it works is you have the city boss who controls the activities for the political party. So I believe he was a Democrat. And so he creates this kind of patronage system. So underneath him was a ward boss, and then underneath the ward boss were local precinct workers and captains. And so what they would do is an immigrant would come off the boat from Ellis Island, and they would say, "Hey, how you doing?" Usually they would be roughly the same background. So if it were, Italian, it would be an Italian guy. If it were, I don't know, Spanish, it'd be a Spanish person. "Hey, how you doing? Let me show you around. Let me take you around. Do you need a job? Do you have a place to live? You need food? You need clothing so you can get a job?" And basically they become their best friend. And so they take them around, they show them, where to live, they take them to places to eat, they give them some food, and then at the end, there's the kind of buy-in where they tell them, okay, basically, I work for Boss Tweed, I work for Tammany Hall. When it comes time for you to vote, I want you to come talk to me, and we'll get it taken care of. Of course, they're more than willing to get them registered to vote. They're more than willing to help them, get everything set up so that they can control the vote, and that's how they would do it. And so it would work right on up the chain. The city boss, when the mayor of the city would say, "I've got an opening for a treasurer or accountant," Boss Tweed would, get the word out to a friend, "Hey, there's a position for an accountant that's in City Hall," and they would get him in, and basically they owed him that job. And so whenever he needed to call in a favor, he could. It's like a mob, you know. So one of the big issues that comes out of, and we talked about the corruption. This is numero uno corruption in terms of the patronage system. But you have the Credit Mobilier scandal, which is basically several politicians or stockholders in the Union Pacific Railroad formed a company, the Credit Mobilier of America, and then they gave out contracts to the railroad. And then they sell shares to the construction company, to congressmen who can award the railroad or the credit company contracts. So you give me a contract, I give you shares in the company. And this was a huge corruption charge that fell largely on politicians. But there are hundreds of examples of this. In terms of federal oversight and ideas of free enterprise, there is a separation between what people see as federal oversight versus free enterprise. Government would allow for, let's say, a trust to be busted up, but then if you tried to come in and regulate a company and tell them what to do, that was seen as an overextension of federal oversight. So if it aided free enterprise, then the government would support it. If it didn't, then chances are the government would stay away. And that was really how the Gilded Age politics worked. You have the assassination of James Garfield, and Garfield was assassinated by a man who worked on his election campaign, who for some reason believed that Garfield owed him a position because he had worked so hard on the campaign. And so he ends up shooting Garfield at a function and claiming that he was owed this job. And what this does is it really drives sentiment towards the Civil Service Act of 1883, which essentially made some positions subject to the civil service exam. So if you had an opening, let's say, in the government for a typist, you had to, it limited the patronage, it limited the ability for somebody to just place somebody in the position, and you would have to take the civil service exam and then prove that you were a good typist, and then you could have the job. A lot of these jobs under the Civil Service Act or the Pendleton Act, depending on what you call it, were lower level. They weren't higher level yet. But this was seen as a concession, especially after Garfield's assassination. Yeah. Okay. The stalwarts versus the half-breeds. Stalwarts were people who were in support of patronage system and did not want the Civil Service Act to pass. And the half-breeds were members of Congress who were fighting for the Civil Service Act to pass. So that's where those two terms come from. But keep in mind, there is a large group supporting the stalwarts who want them to prevent any kind of civil service reform to take place. This is, yeah, I mean, basically, this is not a very popular thing. The only reason they got it passed was because of Garfield's assassination. So some of the reform legislation, you have the Interstate Commerce Act, which is formed. And the cartoon to the right is talking about the ICC. Basically, what they were trying to do was to regulate the railroad rates that they were charging merchants and farmers. And the ghost is actually Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was one of the richest men in New York, in the country, who would have been appalled. Of course, he was dead. That's why he's a ghost. By the passage of the ICC and the fact that the government could regulate the railroad. Remember, this is a period where free enterprise was seen as inherent in the Constitution as a right. And this was seen as government regulation and government overstep. Sherman Antitrust Act was passed largely to break up trusts, like Standard Oil Trust was the main target. And basically, again, this is where free trade needs to be preserved. And so this is why the Sherman Antitrust Act is challenged, but is ruled constitutional, because what it is doing is it's making sure that it's a level playing field and it's free trade. Many people believe the Interstate Commerce Act was not restraining free trade, or I'm trying to save free trade. They felt that the ICC was the government trying to control business. And you can kind of see where both sides of that would be could be read that way. So the labor movement largely comes out of the difference between the have and the have-nots. This is a great example right here. You see the picture in the middle is, obviously in the tenement housing where the workers lived, and the pictures on the right are where the capitalist or the owner of the company lived. I don't think you have any problem seeing the differences between the two. But there certainly is, within the Gilded Age, a huge difference between the people who had the money and the people who didn't, or the wage workers. So this drives the rise of the labor movement. And so we see a number of cases where labor begins to challenge, basically to a violent challenge against the company owners. And the first real major labor conflict in the United States is the railroad strike of 1877. And what's really important about this is that it grinds the railroad movement along the East Coast to a halt for quite a while. And what happens is the owners of the railroad were announcing a 10% wage cut across the board. And so strikers just stopped what they were doing and went on strike. In some cases, the companies tried to bring in strike breakers, which were workers to take the place of the laborers that were on strike. And in those cases, the strikers actually went out and began damaging the railroad ties, the railroad, the trains themselves, the engines. So they began damaging property. Benjamin Hayes had just been elected, and so he ends up calling in federal troops to squash the strike. And this leads to some violent confrontations in Baltimore and Philadelphia and across the United States. And in all, you had about 100 people die. But it's seen as the indication that the government from this point forward will not side with the workers, but instead will side with the capitalists. The Knights of Labor is formed by Uriah Stevens in 1869. It quickly gains members. It includes all workers, and it welcomes, the unskilled as well as the skilled laborers. Um, they try to avoid strikes, um, which was probably a smart thing to do. But they began to slowly embrace the idea that they're going to have to use them and use them effectively. So a lot of their demands centered around an 8-hour workday, also child labor laws preventing child labor. Don't think that that is because they were worried about kids. It was more because of labor competition. Restrictions on convict labor as well, and they began pushing for graduated income tax. They began to accept African American workers and women, um, and they also accepted employers as well as their workers. Now, granted, don't believe that they would take in, Andrew Carnegie or someone like that, but they're looking from a supervisory level down. Okay. In 1886, we have the Haymarket Riot, which takes place in Chicago. This is seen as one of the biggest labor conflicts in the United States history. It was started as a rally for the 8-hour workday, with workers meeting in the Haymarket Square in Chicago. Someone throws a stick of dynamite into the crowd, and the police just start shooting. They end up pulling 8 individuals who were anarchists that they believe caused the blast, which is centered there. The picture is in the center down there. 8 of them were convicted of conspiracy. Of the 8, 7 were sentenced to death, and 1 was sentenced to 15 years in jail. But it led to the recognition of the May Day celebration, which has always been kind of a highlight of recognizing labor history in the United States. The American Federation of Labor is another kind of labor union that develops during this time period. It's formed in 1886 in Columbus, Ohio. It's made up of craft unions, and it required members in the same industry to be grouped together by industry, regardless of occupation. So if you were working for the railroad and you were, I don't know, a conductor, you would be grouped together with porters that would work with the railroad or any other people that were working within the railroad. It's kind of a problem, though, because that means that what you're looking for or what you're specifically focused on or your agenda may not be the same as what other people within the same industry are working towards. And so that's an issue that the AFL has to deal with. And the CIO, in a few modules, will remedy that situation. But Samuel Gompers was elected the AFL president every year except for one from the founding convention until his death in 1924. So Gompers is considered to be Mr. AFL. The Homestead Strike in 1892 takes place in Pennsylvania. This is between workers at the Homestead Steelworks, which were all part of Andrew Carnegie's company. Carnegie goes on vacation and leaves Henry Clay Frick. And if you've been to New York and you've been to the Frick Museum, that is the same guy. He hires Pinkerton guards to take care of the strikers, and of course there's an altercation, and basically 12 people are killed. But again, the point of all of this, and they're using the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, by the way, which was a private security firm, kind of like Blackwater is today. What's interesting about this is that the capitalists are approaching it as violently as the strikers are. I don't think the strikers are intending for it to be violent, but it winds up being that way. In all of these confrontations with the labor movements, it's always violent, which is it's unfortunate. The Pullman strike, and this is George Pullman, who ran or who owned um, the Pullman Car Company, which was the passenger cars for the railroad. Um, Same kind of thing. What ends up happening is Pullman partners with the governor of Illinois, um, and um, you have eventually the federal troops come in. The governor calls in the troops to pull down the strike, and the president gets involved and calls in federal troops to put it down as well. So again, it's a violent confrontation. You have about 30 people who were killed and another 50 plus who were injured. So what's interesting about all of this during this period is it's a violent period for labor. It's a violent period um, in terms of the birth of the labor movement. What really becomes the labor movement of the modern era had a very violent birth. Lots and lots of um, fighting, injuries, deaths, all of that. Um, so lastly, you're looking at a slide, which I think is in your book, and it goes from 1870, 1900, 1920, and it shows you the farms, and it kind of summarizes what we've been talking about. Um, but basically, the Gilded Age we tend to think of it as being this period of great wealth and people being what's the word I'm looking for, kind of the high period of American history. But hopefully what you're seeing is that there's obviously more to the story and more to consider.